The story of Sony Millbrook is a tragic one, reflecting the devastation that domestic violence can cause. Born into a large and close-knit family, Sony experienced beautiful moments in her childhood, but her life was quickly threatened by a violent relationship with Lakeith Moody. Despite trying to find freedom and safety for herself and her children, Sony still cannot escape the shadow of the past. Her life is a testament to strength and resilience, but also a warning about the dangers hidden in love. Sony Millbrook, born February 15, 1981 in Memphis, Tennessee, USA. She is the daughter of Christine Millbrook Bennett and grew up in a close-knit family with 2 sisters, 3 brothers, and an extended family. This environment fostered a strong bond between Sony and her cousin, Jenny, a relationship that would become especially important as Sony entered her teens. By 1998, Sony had become a famous figure at her high school, standing out in both personality and appearance. Just 17 years old and still in 8th grade, she met a man named Lakeith Moody, a few years older than her. Their relationship began soon after but quickly became a tumultuous chapter in Sony's life. Moody was abusive and his violent behavior left clear marks on Sony's body. Despite the turmoil in their relationship, they had 4 children together, 3 daughters and a son, the latter named after Moody's father. In 1999, Sony's mother noticed her daughter had bruises on her chest. The worry in her eyes reflected the growing fear in Sony's heart. With tears streaming down his face, Sony admitted the bruises were the result of Moody's rage. A close friend also noticed Sony was injured, but despite mounting evidence of abuse, Sony refused to report Moody. He was manipulative and controlling, isolating her from friends and family, creating a life of fear and dependence. Later that year, Sony moved to an apartment in the Fraser section of Memphis, seeking independence. However, the darkness of her past pursued her. One day, the apartment management informed her about a disturbance in her apartment. Rushing home, Sony witnesses chaos. Her apartment has been ransacked. Furniture was slashed, clothes were lost, and the TV was gone. Food was scattered all over the walls. Toiletries were scattered everywhere, even under the stairs. A chilling message is scrawled on the mirror in red nail polish. "Kiki loves you," the nickname that has been ominously bestowed upon her. On October 31, 2000, Halloween night, Sony, cousin Pamela, and Moody went to a bar called Mirage. The night quickly turned sour when Moody, in an unprovoked rage, slapped Sony and threw a drink in her face. Humiliated and scared, Sony and Pamela left the bar. In the car, Pamela noticed that Sony was shaking, her body showing extreme fear. Sony, desperate for safety, begged Pamela to take her home before Moody returned. Back at her apartment, Sony barricaded the door with a padlock and chain, trying to create a fragile barrier between her and the man who had become her tormentor. But her efforts were in vain. An hour later, Moody arrived, screaming and banging on the door, his anger echoing through the thin walls. Pamela tried to reason with him, even threatening to call the police. Once Sony calmed down, she urged her cousin to leave and assured her that she would be okay. However, that assurance was short-lived. That evening, Pamela received a call that sent chills down her spine. Sony was at the hospital. Somehow, Moody found his way into the apartment. When Sony tried to end the relationship, he retaliated with a brutal assault. He tore off her clothes and hit her on the head, face, arms, breasts, and between her thighs. Her body was covered in bruises, a tooth was loose, and she lost consciousness when Moody strangled her until she passed out. The violence did not stop there. Immediately after this attack, Moody found birth control pills in Sony's apartment. Enraged, he assaulted her again the next morning, continuing the cycle of abuse that had become her reality. Every bruise, every mark on her body tells the story of a life trapped in fear, a woman trying to escape the grip of a man who sees her as nothing more than anything, a possession. At the end of 2008, Sony Millbrook, at the age of 27, experienced a painful miscarriage. Her health condition was so serious that she had to call Pamela, asking for help to get to the hospital. Sony works at Christian Academy, where she is known as a reliable and punctual employee. When she has to be absent, the reason is often very important. On one such occasion, she called her boss to inform her that she could not come to work because her face was badly bruised, and she did not want the students to see her in that condition. Leslie, her manager, gave her the day off to recover. When Sony returned a few days later, the bruising on her body was still so severe that her director allowed her to wear sunglasses even while in the academy. In conversations with her superiors, Sony opened up about the attacks she endured from her ex-boyfriend, Lakeith Moody. She said Moody once chased her in his car, trying to force her off the road during the pursuit. Moody's violence was not limited to Sony but also affected her family. In April 2008, Moody was found parked in an SUV with a gun, even though he was prohibited from possessing guns due to convictions for theft and drug possession. The situation became more serious on October 6, 2008. Sony failed to show up at the academy at 5 p.m., and when her boss received a text from Sony informing her that Moody was holding her hostage at home and had beaten her all day, he immediately called the police. 2 officers went to Sony's apartment but received no response because the door was locked from the inside. They called the fire department, and when firefighters broke down the door, police saw Moody jump out of a window at the back of the apartment. Sony stood in the hallway, crying and unable to say anything due to his miserable state. Her 4 children stood by, creating a heartbreaking scene with Sony covered in bruises and scratches on her face and neck. When she calmed down, Sony explained to police that Moody and she had argued, and he refused to let her leave the house. Sony said Moody did not open the door earlier because he did not allow her or the children near the door or window. She also said that Moody hurt one of their children by grabbing him and preventing her from taking him to the hospital. She explained that Moody was physically and emotionally abusive, tying a baby blanket around her neck and choking her until she lost consciousness. Moody also threatened to suffocate her again and promised that next time he would kill her. Although police searched the area, Moody could not be found. Sony left the house with his children in his car. 3 days after the incident, she applied for a restraining order against Moody because she feared for her safety and wished to prevent any contact from him. However, she missed court on October 23rd, and the protective order was never granted. Nearly 6 months later, on March 10, 2009, the situation became serious again when Moody, who was supposed to take his children to the doctor, instead began a violent argument with Sony. He accused her of having a new boyfriend, and the argument quickly escalated when Moody slapped her and pulled her hair. Sony managed to break free and ran out of the apartment while Moody continued to scream and threaten to kill her. In anger, Moody took their youngest child, an infant, and drove away at high speed. A police patrol, alerted to a domestic disturbance, arrived just as Moody was fleeing. Officers tried to stop Moody, but he escaped. In early 2010, Sony, at 28 years old, was studying at Southeast Tennessee Community College. She had just given birth to her 5th child. but the child's health was so poor that she had to stay home to take care of it. While her life is still heavily affected by the pain from her past, Sony continues to struggle to find peace for herself and her children. Sony and her children moved to the Budget Lodge in Memphis, looking for a place to get away from the increasing stress in their lives. The first day at the motel, the altercation between Sony and Moody became so noisy that hotel staff had to intervene to resolve the situation. The sound of arguing disturbed other guests, making peace elusive. Their conflict didn't just stop at the noise, it also caught the attention of the hotel staff. On January 22nd, hotel security witnessed Moody in an extremely agitated state. He drove at high speed in front of Sony's room and began shouting at her as she stood on the second-floor balcony with her children. In anger, Moody threw a grocery bag at Sony. When security approached and asked Moody to keep the noise down and not throw objects, Moody locked his car and left, but not before he was followed up to the third floor to a room registered under no one's name. The guard asked Moody for the keys to any room he had. Surprisingly, Moody produced the keys to 3 other rooms, albeit unregistered. That evening, Sony and the children moved into room 222. The night manager told Moody to leave the area, and although he complied, the altercations continued for days afterward. The security guard repeatedly warned Moody and asked him to leave the house permanently. When Moody did not return that night, the guard asked him not to return. On January 26th, Sony called Pamela, shared with her the stresses in her life, and said she was staying at a motel. She expressed her desire to tell Pamela something important and promised to call back if she left the motel or if Moody left first. The next morning, Sony took her children to daycare and her oldest child to school. At approximately 11 a.m., the housekeeping manager knocked on room 222's door to remind Sony of the need to pay or leave. However, Moody opened the door and the room was dark. The manager was informed that Moody's mother was on her way with the money. Hotel security guards checked room 222 around 2:30 p.m. and found the room empty, with bags of children's clothes and many other items scattered on the floor. A bag of children's clothes is placed on the bed, while the other bed is tidied up. On January 27th, the situation became serious when Sony did not pick up her eldest daughter on time. The school secretary called Christine, the child's grandmother, asking her to come pick him up. Christine tried calling Sony but received no response. At about 6 p.m., Christine noticed that her other grandchildren were still at daycare and became worried because they were not responding. She asked her husband to pick up the children from daycare while she went to school, believing something was wrong. They contacted police, and at about 10:30 p.m., police arrived at the daycare. On January 28th, the housekeeping manager returned to room 222, which was now empty. He began cataloging and tagging the belongings that tenants had left behind to avoid paying. The room was filled with clothes and a large trash bag had been taken to the storage area. After cleaning, the room is prepared for new guests. James and Rhonda Sargent, new tenants, moved in January and noticed a foul odor in the room. They tried to hide the smell with incense, but it wasn't enough. They also discovered that previous tenants had attempted to do the same, finding scented tissues on the tiles and ceiling, and the odor was especially strong when someone sat on the bed. On January 29th, officers from the Memphis Police Department's Missing Persons Unit went to the hotel to investigate Sony's whereabouts, as this was the last place she was seen. However, they did not enter room 222. On February 2nd, Moody was found around 7 p.m. inside a Sony vehicle parked at a shopping mall. He was arrested for car theft and detained by police for 48 hours. That night, he was questioned about Sony's disappearance. Moody claimed that the last time he saw Sony was on January 26th, when they met at about 7 a.m. After Sony dropped her children off at school on the morning of January 26th, Moody went into the hotel room with her, where they had an intimate conversation before Moody went out to get Sony's car keys and left the hotel. Moody said Sony planned to use her social media and student loans to buy a new car, so he didn't see a problem with keeping her car. He claimed that since January 26th, he had been living in Sony's car. However, investigators discovered that Moody had actually been staying at another hotel, and they were unable to confirm that he had been living in the car due to poor weather conditions, with snow falling during that period. On February 3rd, a debit card in the name of Sony, along with several recent purchase receipts, were found in her car. That same day, police checked the clothing storage at the hotel, hoping to find DNA or other evidence, but they collected nothing useful. Adding to their frustration was the fact that Moody had to be released due to insufficient evidence linking Sony to his disappearance. Meanwhile, Sony's cousin and mother endured the pain of going to the hotel to collect her belongings. Sony's cousin, although sensing the direness of the situation, found no evidence to support his feelings. On February 4th, police visited Moody's uncle's house and discovered a DVD player from the hotel room in Sony's wallet. Moody gave these items to his cousin, who reported that Moody borrowed the DVD player on January 24th, under the pretense of watching a movie, and that he drove the red car that day. A few days later, his cousin met Moody again and asked about the reason for not picking up his child on January 27th, but Moody avoided the question when asked about Sony's whereabouts. After leaving his DVD player and wallet in his pocket, Moody left the house. On February 7th, James and Rhonda Sargent returned to room 222 for further testing, which included spending the night there. They informed management that the odor was still present. By March, a more thorough cleaning was carried out, including carpets, bedding, bathroom curtains, and window blinds. However, the odor not only persisted but also became stronger. The manager discussed the matter with the security guard, and during the conversation, they recalled that the former tenants, including Sony, had disappeared at the end of January. The security guard advised the manager the officer rechecked room 222 for blood or detergent, suggesting that something serious may have happened. About 10 minutes after asking the guard to come with him, the manager returned to room 222. Their discovery was unimaginable. When the manager removed the mattress from one of the beds, he discovered that the bottom of the bed frame had a partition designed to prevent the space underneath from being used for storage. However, the box spring lift area revealed a vast void where anything could be hidden. Peering through the sturdy edges of the bed frame, they saw a gruesome sight: a body in a state of decomposition. Immediately, the manager and security guard called the police to the scene. The bed frame had marks all over the body and 2 broken pieces of wood near the head of the bed. There was a towel and a cloth bag placed between the body's legs. The body was wearing a shirt but was completely nude from the waist down. The forensic team determined the cause of death was strangulation with a coaxial cable, with the wire wrapped around the neck, one arm around the chest and ending in the back. The medical examiner concluded that death would have occurred after at least 2 to 3 minutes of continuous pressure from the cable. DNA samples from the body matched Sony's genetic profile and showed clear signs of being female. However, there were also traces of male DNA on 5 sections of the cable. The main theory put forth is that Sony was dead when he was reported missing, and that Moody used a coaxial cable from a DVD player that he had borrowed from his cousin. This shows that Moody intentionally committed this action before being discovered and detained by the police. Moody, considered the prime suspect because he was the last person Sony was seen alive, was arrested in Sony's car. When he was taken to the Mason Detention Center on March 18th, police announced an internal investigation to clarify the strange circumstances of the case. They acknowledged that the Sony family deserved answers and explained that although they pursued a different avenue of investigation, the discovery still transcends fiction and stands out in domestic violence cases. They also expressed regret that the room had been cleaned and rented out multiple times since Sony's death, which had complicated police efforts to collect evidence. This explanation was quickly questioned. Rhonda Sargent, one of the first tenants to stay in room 222, where Sony's body was found, shared with the media that if police had asked to enter the room during their visit in January, perhaps they discovered something. Not long after the discovery of the body, the manager, along with the security guard, did a more thorough examination in room 222. Their discovery was shocking and horrifying. When the manager removed the mattress from one of the beds, he discovered that the bottom of the bed frame had a barrier that prevented the use of the space under the bed frame. However, when the box spring lifting area was removed, a large void was revealed, suggesting that a large object may have been hidden. Peering through the sturdy edges of the bed frame, they discovered a body in the process of decomposition. The manager and security guard immediately called the police to the scene. The bed frame has marks from heavy objects and 2 broken pieces of wood near the head of the bed. A towel and a cloth bag were found between the legs of the body, which was wearing only a shirt and was completely nude from the waist down. Forensic experts determined the cause of death was strangulation with a coaxial cable, with the wire wrapped around the neck, one arm around the chest and ending in the back. According to the medical examiner's assessment, death must have taken at least 2 to 3 consecutive minutes to occur. The DNA sample from the body matched Sony's genetic profile and showed clear signs of being female. At the same time, male DNA was found on 5 segments of the cable. From this evidence, the main theory is that Sony was dead when reported missing, and that Moody used a coaxial cable from a DVD player that he borrowed from his cousin. This shows that Moody had intended to carry out this action in advance and had prepared it before being arrested by the police. On March 24th, a loving and dignified funeral was held to bid farewell to Sony. Her children were placed under the care of her sister and husband before April 1st. They are working to get legal guardianship of the children. Sony's sister expressed that although the children were the main victims, the tragic loss disrupted the lives of the entire family. She pledged to take care of Sony's children, making sure they had enough food, clothes, and toys, and keeping them together as a family. Sony receives benefits from social programs, and her card was topped up shortly before the incident as part of a tax refund on her income. Police tracked the card's movements and discovered it had been used on February 1st, 4 days after Sony disappeared. The card was used at a convenience store where Sony regularly withdraws cash using an electronic benefit transfer card on the first day of the month. Store employees provided video from 16 security cameras at 11:38 a.m. on February 1st. The surveillance system recorded a man wearing a yellow shirt using a Sony card to buy a bottle of orange juice, withdraw some cash, and buy a cigar. After making the purchase, the person returned to a car driven by another person. With all the evidence against Moody, his trial began in the first week of February 2014, more than 4 years after the crime. At this time, Budget Lodge Hotel is closed. Moody pleaded not guilty, while prosecutors described the case as a tragic end to a tumultuous relationship. Moody's defense attorney emphasized the lack of conclusive evidence, including witnesses or physical evidence, and pointed out that the fingerprints on the bed frame did not match Moody's fingerprints. He suggested that someone else might have killed Sony, given that she had been involved with many other men over the years. On February 6th, video showing Moody using a Sony prepaid card 4 days after her death was presented in court. The defense argued that his calm demeanor throughout the transaction demonstrated his innocence, while the prosecution saw it as evidence of a cold-blooded and ruthless man. On February 7th, 2014, Moody was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. On February 10th, he appealed the verdict, arguing that the court had considered his family history and violent behavior without sufficient evidence. On July 7th, 2015, the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the conviction and affirmed the sentences. Meanwhile, Sony's loss continues to deeply affect her family, and investigations and appeals continue to attract public attention. Sony Millbrook's life ended tragically, but her story is not only one of pain but also a voice for those living in the darkness of domestic violence. Her children will continue to carry on their mother's legacy, and it is hoped that Sony's experiences will help raise awareness of this issue in society. Behind every painful story is a valuable lesson, and we need to listen to never let the same thing happen to others.